To know where we're going, we need to know where we've been. It's that age-old saying, and the same is true for us. We're just over 5 years old now, and in that time we went from rank amateurs to semi-amateur watch producers. In our quest to offer exciting and unique watches, we've run the gamut of techniques that we can deploy to try and distinguish ourselves from the humongous amount of choice in watchland. And we've done that through a process of trial and error, so trying various things that we've seen or things that we think might work and seeing how it goes, whether that be a unique case shape or a dial profile or colourways, textures, things like that. And through this process of trying and failing and succeeding, we've arrived at a kind of toolkit of stuff that we have subsequently repeated on various designs. But coming into 2020, we wanted to kind of collate everything that we've learned so far, from both a watch design standpoint and a watch production standpoint. What works in production and what doesn't. And by doing that, we have learned lessons and applied the most successful components of our watch design catalogue so far. So the first 3 models were in quick succession. We had the Chairwell, the Derwent and the Lomand. And the Chairwell was the kind of genesis of Marlowe Watch Company. It was a byproduct of collaboration between Oliver and I. He was the guy that sought me out and used me as a kind of gun for hire to get his vision of what a modern take on a dress watch would be, using manual winding movements. And at that point in time, at our entry level point, there wasn't any kind of manual winding watches around. So Oliver was very much the driving force behind the Chairwell, and he kind of still is the driving force behind a lot of our brief ideas and the direction that we go in. We have a number of different textures going on, the biggest of which is the Subdial, which is this really aggressive radial pattern that catches the light in such a way it's called anisotropy, and it's like the bottom of your saucepan. You know, it has that kind of radial sunburst feel, which happens when you use concentrically spaced circles. So we deployed that on the Subdial, but didn't use any markings. The justification behind that was that it's just there to show you that the watch is running. You don't need it to show you each second. So we had that kind of like a ghost Subdial. One of the things that we have continued on is the polished battens that are applied on top of this raised level, and it just gives you that layering, that depth of dial, which we found really interesting. The Derwent was a strange one for us because at that point we were very much still finding our feet. We didn't have any kind of direction we wanted to go in. Final result from the Derwent project was quite a jazzy set of dials that maybe didn't fit into our kind of brand direction at that time. It was a really interesting project, we learned a lot, but we didn't really take very much away from that for future designs. The Lomand was and still is, I think, the most popular watch we've done. This project came right off the back of the Chairwell Kickstarter campaign, and in the December of 15 I had kind of sketched this idea I had for a chrono style watch. At that point it was influenced kind of by space shuttles and orbits and moon landings and whatnot. But again, we used a number of techniques that we had learned from the Chairwell campaign. So the Subdials have that radial texture, and we've used applied polished blocks. But I think with the Lomand, It's the openness of the dial that makes it work. You know, it's quite a big watch at 43mm, but it looks very clean still. I think that's the ethos we bring to most things, is if it doesn't need to be there, then we don't put it there. And we've followed that ethos through with all our watches, which is why a lot of them are very simple. It gives the dial a bit of breathing space, and the number one attribute for a watch has to be legibility. And if you start adding all these different fussy parts or complexity into the dial, you start losing the ability to quickly glance down and see what time it is. So the lomand was a kind of exercise in that. We used computer programs to render out the refraction of the curved crystal so that we could see how the markings would be magnified or distorted. And we harnessed that so that from dead on you could only see the minute markings, but if you start tilting it at a more oblique angle, the finer markings were revealed. It was a smart visual trick to try and bring out an element of legibility to a dial that could end up quite fussy. So the Haskell project was our first real go at a higher end Swiss watch. And the initial concept for the Haskell was this one-piece scalloped dial. There was something really appealing about this beautiful, chalky bowl shape. We tried to retain that scallop whilst using a two-part dial. And onto this dial we affixed applied indexes, kind of block shape, you know, to give a bit of depth to the dial. There's something really dynamic about having a block protruding from a surface, especially at this scale. The light plays off and your eye catches it immediately. So we used a bunch of applied blocks around the dial, created that lollipop around the date as a way to have a unique way of framing that controversial element to the dial. You know, a lot of people don't like dates on watches for some reason, so if it's going to be there, then you make sure it's there and you don't try and disguise it. The most popular of the Haskells is the sand, and I think that's primarily down to the texture that is on the main dial surface. It's a really fine sandpaper texture, but it just diffuses the light and kind of adds a little bit of sparkle. We also used black nickel plated blocks for this, and the contrast in this dial is just so easy to read, which, like I said, is one of the main requisites of a watch's legibility. So the takeaway from the Haskell project was using a sandpaper texture with applied blocks is quite effective. The Mora is a kind of personal triumph for me. It's such a long project to get from like initial concept through to production. There was a number of tripping points and we shelved the project for a year, and it wasn't until we relinquished the necessity for it to be a manual movement that the project rose from the ashes. So I'm so pleased that it's here, because it has been a real struggle to see it through. I've always liked dive watches, but I've found the market for that type of watch very samey. You know, it's like an iterative landscape. You could see in each dive watch that's available where they've gained influence or where they've replicated or whatever it is. And to try and bring something new to this arena was quite difficult, because the framework that you have to work within for a dive watch is very strict. So you need the bezel to show you a 60-minute countdown. It is expected that you'd have the gradations from 15 minutes down in minute increments. Legibility has to be paramount for a dive watch. And then you get onto specs like depth ratings and material quality and whatnot. So my way around it was kind of to create a unibody style design where it was a uniform material from case back up to bezel, and then use deeply machined grooves to represent the markings. I thought it'd be quite interesting as a longevity device. You know, a lot of these bezels on dive watches are painted markings, or they're a ceramic, or some of them have a kind of sapphire cap on top of a underlying aluminium ring. And the tendency for that is to crack or to become matte over time or fade, whereas if you just machine the metal, it'll remain that way forever. But it's created this really unique aesthetic which I really love. And then on the side profile of the bezel, we've created this rifling texture which you can't see from the front, you can only see it from the side. So again, we're bringing a kind of element of simplicity to the whole shooting match. And the dial of the Morar is simplicity itself. You know, it's just 12 blocks with square hands. Somebody actually called this brutal, and I really liked that term. You know, I think it was intended as an insult, but I didn't take it like that. I thought it was brilliant. You know, this watch is designed to withstand some serious stuff, pretty much all that Mother Nature can throw at it. So if the watch isn't brutal because of that, then maybe it's not doing its job right. Our latest one, the Coniston. So the Coniston is a kind of byproduct of everything that we'd learned at that point, from the Chairwell through lomand, through haskell and through Morar. The Coniston came out before the Morar, but the Coniston is again an exercise in using the layering of a dial to be exciting. So from the underside of the crystal all the way down to the moat of loom, and then built up back onto that, it creates the perception of huge amount of depth, even though the dimension is maybe 3mm or 4mm. So it was a really interesting exercise into utilising that space between the top of the movement and the underside of the crystal to try and introduce as much visual depth as possible. And then you have the skeletonized hands on top of that, of which we quite enjoyed the idea of having an overlapping hand. It revealed the hand below it to create this one uniform hand. And by doing that, you're extending that depth upwards, because you're getting the layering of the hands, then the dial, and then the luminous moat at the bottom. I think that's what people really do enjoy about the Coniston, and it's a feedback that we've been getting, is that the dial is so exciting to see, especially when the light hits it from outside or in your house or wherever it is. The shadows that are cast and the reflections that you get are just exciting because of all those layers. So there we go, that's where we've been. So coming into this year, we've deployed a number of those things that we've learned over the past 5 years. A number of techniques like the Subdial and the Chairwell, that sandpaper dial texture, we've used that again. But we've used a lot of our learning, generally just up our game a little bit, using everything that we've learned so far. Our process has always been a trial and error process, and never has it been more the case than the past 5 years. And again, into this year, we're still finding areas that we can streamline and improve. So that's what it's all about, I guess, is learning and improving and doing better and iterating till you get to the standard that you want to be at, which for us is pretty high.